Tom Kippola, the Chasm Group. This is one of our kind of outside-in talks, right? I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the concept of crossing the chasm. It's kind of become a mainstream concept in the business world, kind of architected in the 90s, a seminal concept that Tom and his group kind of developed structure around to understand why things go from like tiny and small and how do they find their ways into the mainstream. How do things start small and millions of things that start, many of which don't find their way to the mainstream? What is that structure? What does that look like? How does that happen? And are the world's leading kind of subject matter experts on that concept, working with hundreds and hundreds of some of the most successful companies in the world, around the world, helping them understand how a little nascent thing like direct care, right? How can it get to the mainstream? What are the things that have to happen to make it get there? So Tom's going to be talking to us about that concept and how it applies to direct care. Tom Kippola, everybody.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning to all of you. I'm happy to be here for a number of reasons. I enrolled at a direct care provider about 6 months ago, so I'm already starting to see the benefits of direct care. And I'm a big supporter of this movement for all the reasons that have been suggested already and for all the reasons that you're here. So I think I'm here for one reason. As Mike mentioned, I've spent the last 25 years helping new innovations accelerate and eventually crack into the mainstream. And what I want to talk to you about today are some of the principles that my firm uses and some of the experiences that I've had that I think apply to the direct care movement. And I'm going to start out talking about a threat to this movement, and then I'm going to move to a few frameworks that help frame that threat. And by the end of the talk, I have a few recommendations. And my hope is that these frameworks and these ideas that I'm sharing with you here form the basis of some of the side conversations and some of the breakout sessions and the lunch conversation and so on and so forth. So to kick us off, we know that this is an early movement, and we know it's growing fast. These are stats that were supplied by DPC Frontier, which indicated that about a year ago there were about 270 direct care practices, and today there are about 620 practices. And it's normal at this point in a market to simply extrapolate and assume that the market will continue growing at roughly the same rate for the next several years. So we're probably all here assuming and hoping that it looks more like an A or B trajectory and hopefully not a C or D trajectory. And it's also normal to assume that the way to make the movement continue at the same rate is all we have to do is talk about all the benefits of switching to direct care. The benefits for doctors, the benefits for consumers, the benefits for payers. But there is a threat to this movement that is separate and different from the benefits. And it's that threat that I want to speak to for much of this presentation. And that threat is fear. In preparation for this talk, over the last several weeks, I've spoken to a number of direct care providers, many of whom are in this room, some of whom will be on stage later today. And I asked them a series of questions. And one of the questions I asked them was, when you go out and speak to your friends that are fee-for-service providers, and you talk about all of the benefits of direct care that you've experienced, that your patients have experienced, what is their reaction? And almost universally, I heard the words afraid and fear. Afraid they're going to fail, afraid that they can't make the movement, afraid that they're not able to hold a 90-minute meeting with a patient because they're so trained on holding 10-minute meetings with patients. So fear came up over and over when they were talking about their friends. But they're not alone. The folks that have already converted to this model also had a lot of fear when they made the switch. So one of the questions I asked was, in the weeks before you made this decision to switch to direct care, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being most anxious, how anxious were you when you were approaching that decision to switch? And the answers you can see here that I got back were 7, 8s, and 9s. And perhaps even more extraordinary than the numbers is the words that they had wrapped around those. These were 7, 8s, and 9s that they were going to fail. So the consequences here have been pretty high. And for a human being to rate their anxiety level a 7, 8, or 9, but still go ahead and switch, is an extraordinary feat. And most humans in a situation like that wouldn't make the switch. And in fact, there are a couple models that explain that. So the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to a social psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, who is a professor at Princeton, who found that when human beings switch from something that they have to something that replaces the something that they have, going from a gasoline-powered car to an electric car, going from fee-for-service to direct primary care, that the average person weighs the losses that they perceive from that switch 3 times more than they desire the gains. So you all see where this is going, but I want to get very explicit because the rest of this presentation is based on this foundation. If we asked a fee-for-service provider today who had not made the switch to list all of the benefits of making the switch, better for the provider, better for the patient, better for the federal budget, better for the world, and we asked them to rate those benefits, and they rated them a 10 on a scale of 10, and then we asked them to list what they might lose as a result of the switch and rate that, it would only take a 4 on the other side of that equation to have the weighted number be a 12. 12 is greater than 10, and they're not going to adopt. So so this is for the average person. Now, there are other social scientists and behavioral economists who have repeated research like this. And in general, they find that the average human being, when making a switch, will weigh losses 2 to 4 times higher than they weigh the gains. But I actually think it's, I actually think the weighting factor is more significant here, because most of these experiments that have been run on sub-$100 consumer products and services where people are asked to make the switch. And I think we can agree that the consequences here are a lot higher than a switch on a $100 product. So I don't know what the weighting factor would be, but let's say it's a 4x or a 5x, which means to get somebody to switch, they'd have to be a 2 or a 1 on that losses side in order to move. Now, that's the average adopter. But most adopters are not average adopters, and this brings me to another model. And this model has been around for 60 or 70 years. This is the innovation adoption lifecycle model. Most of you have seen versions of this. It's essentially a bell-shaped distribution curve where the vertical axis is the number of first-time adopters, and the horizontal axis are 5 different type of risk-reward profiles, where the bookends start all the way to the left, the innovators who adopt first and are comfortable with uncertainty, comfortable with incomplete solutions, comfortable with not having the formula down. They'll figure it out. And the folks on the other end, on the right side of this, are the laggards who will only adopt new innovations kicking and screaming. So I want to focus most of my attention on 2 other groups here. The early adopters and the mainstream adopters, and particularly the early mainstream adopters. Now, there's 3 ways we could apply this model here, and I'm only going to have time to really apply it in one way. So the 3 ways are: how will providers adopt? Second is how will patients adopt? And third is how will payers adopt? So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about applying this model to providers.
And I'll have a couple short comments to make on patients and payers towards the end. So I want to focus first on the early adopters, who are the second group generally to adopt. And what's unique about early adopters in business markets, and that's what we're talking about here, it's an adoption of a business model and business technologies. The early adopters are oftentimes adopting at that point in time because their motivation is to get ahead of everybody else. They know that if they can get some time-based advantage, a several-year advantage, that they can convert that advantage into a thriving business. And if they waited 2 or 3 or 4 years, they may not have that competitive advantage. So some of you in this room are looking to grow your practices beyond 1 or 2 practitioners. Some of you want to grow your practice to dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of practitioners. So moving now gives you an advantage in doing that you might not have if you waited. However, most human beings want to wait. They want to seek safety in numbers. And so there's a different motivation and a different risk-reward calculus that the mainstream adopters have, which make them unique and different to crack into than the early adopters. And the difference between those 2 groups forms the basis of my group, the Chasm Group. The Chasm Group was formed in the early 90s based on the notion that we believe there's a big difference, and have found there to be a big difference, between the early market adopters, which is a combination of the innovators and the early adopters, versus everybody else. And what typically happens in and around a chasm is the early market is largely done adopting, but the mainstream market is not yet ready to adopt. And that can create a rough patch for that new innovation. In fact, other folks have given this chasm concept different names. Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, called it the Valley of Death. He said this is where new technologies go to die. And sometimes innovations do die there. Other times they just have an elongated period of sort of going sideways. An example of one of those, I think that's relevant to all of us, is the personal digital assistant category, which was launched in the 90s with the Apple Newton, with a lot of fanfare, attracted a lot of early adopters, and after those adopters adopted, it really couldn't crack into the mainstream. So that category arguably spent the next decade in the chasm until the rise of the smartphone. First with the BlackBerry in a niche, and then later on with the iPhone, which was able to get to everybody. So there are a couple reasons that the chasm exists. The first reason is that mainstream adopters prefer to get word of mouth and references from other mainstream adopters. It's not that they don't value references and word of mouth from early adopters, but they know that early adopters are much more adventurous than them, and they don't want to take on the risk of that adventure. So they'd rather hold back and wait until other people that have the same risk-reward profile that they do have adopted, and adopted in number, and stamped an approval of safety on that particular innovation. But let's look at when I talk to some providers about their experience in switching to the direct care model, almost all of them use this phrase leap of faith in moving to the direct care model. And it wasn't just people that I spoke to. I went out on the web, I found some medical journals where direct care providers had written articles or contributed quotes. They were using leap of faith also. This phrase leap of faith to a mainstream adopter is code words for don't adopt. Or at least not yet. They want to wait until it's not a leap of faith. They want to wait until it's safe enough and then other people like them have said it's okay to move forward. So this sounds a little bit like circular reasoning, and it is. If we need mainstream adopters passing on solid word of mouth to break into the mainstream, how do we stop that circular loop? Well, the answer, based on our experience, is we have to go a little bit deeper into why the chasm exists. Usually, in and around the chasm, the solutions that are available, but by solutions, I'm talking about the software solutions, I'm talking about the services solutions, I'm talking about the best practice solutions. Usually, those solutions are not quite complete. They're usually 80% complete. And what a mainstream adopter wants is a complete solution. They're willing to tailor the solution. They're willing to walk into Nordstrom's and point to something on the rack and say, tailor that for me, but they don't want it built stitch by stitch. And they certainly don't want to buy an outfit that's 80% complete, but the other 20%, the arms or the legs, have to be built stitch by stitch. So generally what has to happen in complex innovation markets is an alliance of vendors has to come together, agree on what the ingredients are for a whole solution, and I'm going to show you some here in a moment. It's a combination of software, services, and best practices, where they all agree what the ingredients are, and then when they're out meeting with mainstream prospects, they're all repeating that same recipe and stating to the mainstream adopters that in fact this recipe has been implemented somewhere before, and what's happening now is they're simply going to repeat it. They're not making it up. So when I ask providers that have made the move what to describe their solutions and how they put their solutions together, this is what I heard. I winged it. I heard I overdid it with consultants, and then this individual listed a number of different types of consultants that he brought in. Or I spoke with 30 DPC and concierge docs over 3 years before making the leap, which is extraordinary because one would assume that after speaking with 30 doctors who had already done this, that you could extract or find a subset of them that had used the same repeatable whole solution, and that he would just have to go find who those vendors were and ask them to repeat that solution over again. But that's not been the case so far, at least with folks that have adopted. So what is that whole solution, what could that whole solution look like here? This is my best guess, and this is my best guess based on speaking with a number of doctors over the last several weeks who have made the move, and speaking to some other industry players. It appears that, and by the way, part of the reason I'm putting this out here is I know that this is probably incomplete. It needs to be tweaked. But my intention in showing this slide is to start a conversation here so that you can all iterate this and come up with a better version of this. But so far the version looks something like this. There are 3 software platforms that need to come together. Hint, the optimized EMR platforms for direct care and a patient communication platform. There are many different vendors in these spaces, but to make this simple, you can think of this as Hint, Elation, Spruce. And what the mainstream adopter wants is not just that those individual ingredients are complete enough. They want those ingredients to be seamlessly working together so they look and feel like one complete software solution. But if all we had to do was integrate the various software solutions necessary here and create a complete solution around them, our journey would be easy. It turns out that there are a whole bunch of other things that we have to wrap around those software solutions in order to deliver the complete solution to a provider who doesn't want to take a lot of risk, who just wants to repeat what works, starting with best practices. And we know that best practices can be delivered a number of ways. They could be delivered through consultants. They could be delivered through training videos or seminars or books. But there are a number of very, very important direct care practices that require a seal of safety, that they've been tried before, and all providers have to do is simply repeat what's been done before. I'll give you one example that came up in the calls that I had. Several providers told me, I asked the question, once you made the decision to convert, what were your top challenges after you made that decision? And did those challenges mix with the anxieties that you had before you made the decision? One of the top answers I got was, am I going to be able to get my fee-for-service patients to convert? And what's the recipe to get them to convert? So one of those providers, this was the individual who had spoken to 30 providers over 3 years and still made the leap, told me that the first 2 or 3 times he tried to convert his patients, it didn't work well. In fact, and this individual is a very meticulous person, so he knew what the industry standard conversion rates were, and he was below those significantly. Until he tweaked it a few more times. So he's experimenting to get it right. Even though he spoke with 30 doctors before, he's still experimenting. And what he found was there were 2 things that ultimately caused his recipe to work. One, he created a 5-minute elevator pitch that he delivered to his patients at the end of every one of his fee-for-service patient visits. And because he needed at least 5 more minutes, and probably more because there was probably some discussion that happened after he delivered the pitch, he had to spread his appointments out further than he had been doing for over a decade. But once he did those 2 things, not only did his conversion rates go up, but his conversion rates now are significantly above the industry average. So this is an example of just one best practice that if it were pasted on a website somewhere or in a video or somewhere else is an incredibly important part of this whole solution. There are other things here, and I don't have time to go into all of these, but obviously we need a bank that can specialize in funding direct care providers. And what the bank can provide is not only the ability to do the domain-specific risk assessment in order to figure out whether they want to extend the loans, but as any bank has to do occasionally, they have to determine when they're going to call in the loan based on whether the entity that they extended the loan to is making or breaking their covenants. And in most industries, there are specialized banks that can figure that out, and they can also recommend other service providers to help mitigate those risks. I've spent the last 25 years in working with venture-backed startups, and it turns out there are 2 banks in the venture capital arena that have built a domain expertise. They understand how to evaluate the risk of a venture-backed startup, and if they see that there's something going wrong, they can refer in others from their ecosystem to help mitigate that risk. So we're going to need folks like that in the solution, and we're going to need law firm or law firms that can provide the standard documents for incorporating the business and all the things that you have to do to give it a pass legally. So there are a whole bunch of things that need to come together. And as I mentioned before, I think the key here is not just the ingredients. It's getting an alliance of these vendors to agree on the ingredients, and when they're out meeting with prospects, they're all repeating the same ingredients, therefore reassuring the prospects, and they're also referring in each other, which also helps reassure the prospects. So I mentioned that I'd spend a couple moments talking about payers and patients. I think they're and the adoption curve for payers and patients, and obviously they're highly interrelated. My understanding is that the bet is that at some point, one or more of the large payer groups will come in and start funding the monthly premiums. And when they do, that will be a big hurdle in helping accelerate the adoption of the patients, which leads me to payer adoption. For payers to adopt, and I'm just going to focus on self-insured employers, large self-insured employers. For them to adopt, they're going to need to make sure that there is a scalable way to bring on enough direct care providers quickly that can scale up to meet the needs of their tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees. And in order to do that, this solution here probably needs to be augmented with some additional software, and probably needs to be augmented with some additional best practices. And the one I'm thinking about in particular is, for a company of 100,000 employees, how do you scale out the communication to 100,000 employees to get them to consider converting to direct care? So there will have to be something different. And the point here is these solutions will have to differ for the different targets that we're going after. So just to kind of put this all in a nutshell, I suspect that there are plenty more early adopters that want to come into this market this year. However, it is my understanding from talking to some folks in the industry that increasingly the folks that are coming in the top of the funnel are looking more and more like mainstream adopters, which means now is the right time to start thinking about what is that whole repeatable solution that mainstream adopters want, and how do we create the proper alliances to put that together. And when the mainstream adopters adopt that repeatable solution, and they then start telling their friends and colleagues, that's when the market really cracks open. Because ultimately, mainstream markets don't crack open because of what vendors say. That vendors can influence it. Vendors can certainly influence crossing the chasm, but ultimately to crack into the broad mainstream market, what really matters is what the mainstream adopters say. In fact, there are a number of significant technology companies that I'm aware of, one publicly, Amazon, who have made the decision to cut back on their marketing communication expenses because they found that the money was better spent in ensuring that the complete solution was there in an effort to get good positive word of mouth. Think Net Promoter Score, for those of you familiar with it. And that positive Net Promoter Score is actually much more powerful in attracting more mainstream adopters than what the vendors have to say. But there is something that the vendors can do as well. As this industry is able to attract more and more mainstream adopters, and they are successful, I do believe that it will be in the vendor's best interest to start celebrating the mainstream adopters more and more, and not just the visionary early adopters. So with that, I believe I am out of time. I hope this framework is useful in the conversations that you have here, in the side conversations and the additional speakers that come up here. And my hope is that what comes out of this event is something that moves the football down the field another 20 yards on this and other topics.